Hello. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar hosted by the Council of State Governments Southern Office, the Southern Legislative Conference, the SLC, entitled SLC State Pensions, Latest Developments. I am Sujit Kanagaretna, Fiscal Policy Manager here at the SLC. Our sincere thanks to our distinguished panel for setting aside time in their busy schedules to be on this webinar and share their expertise with us. I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items first. You all are in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar. We will be recording this webinar and posting it later on the CSG Knowledge Center website at knowledgecenter.csg.org. It will also be available on the SLC website at slcatlanta.org. Today's discussion focuses on public pensions, one of the most vexing fiscal issues confronting every state and local government in the country. Even before the onset of the Great Recession, most state and local government pension plans were struggling to meet their pension and retiree health care obligations. The gaps between assets and liabilities in these public pension plans had widened as a result of plan sponsors failing to make adequate plan contributions, granting unfunded benefit increases, and suffering serious investment losses during the economic downturn. Since the end of the Great Recession, while the run-up in the equity markets have alleviated some of the fiscal pressures faced by public sector pension plans, many plans continue to face major challenges. There are also wide disparities prevalent in the funding positions of plans in states across the country. Here to provide an overview of the latest state pension trends alongside presentations from 2 SLC states on the specific measures initiated to bolster the funding positions of their pension plans are 3 eminently qualified presenters. Our first speaker is Douglas Offerman, Senior Director at Fitch Ratings, U.S. Public Finance Department. He is Fitch's team leader on public pensions and OPEB issues. Doug's extensive research on the topic includes the October 2015 State Pension Update. At Fitch, Doug also coordinates internal training on issues related to retirement obligations. Our second speaker is Representative Barry Ivey. First elected to the Louisiana House of Representatives in 2013, Representative Ivey serves on the Education, Retirement, and Transportation and Highways and Public Works Committees. Finally, our third speaker is Representative Stephen M. Ross, a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives. He was first elected to the chamber in 2012 and chairs both the Pensions and Retirement and Commerce and Job Development Committees while serving on the Banking, Finance, Judiciary, Local Government, and Transportation Committees. Each of our presenters will speak for about 15 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up throughout the program, and we will try to answer as many of them as we have time at the end. Doug, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Sujit, and thank you to the Council of State Governments for having me speak. Indeed, I work for Fitch Ratings. I'm a credit analyst. I've been doing this for about 10 years, and my focus has been on states. And when I'm not rating state governments and their debt issuances, I focus a lot on pensions. If you go to my table of contents slide, that's it's called slide number 1 for me, but I think it may be number 2 for you. It's called, I basically wanted to give an overview of where we view pensions as being right now. Defined benefit pensions of state and local governments in the U.S. To do that, though, I'm going to start first with a brief detour into where pensions fit into the whole credit rating process and why we focus a lot on state and local governments' pension burdens. And then I'll talk a little bit about our report that Sujit mentioned already. It's a report that we update annually, and we last released it just in October of this year. Then I'll go on to speak more specifically as to the burden that states are carrying right now for pension obligations, and then a few takeaway points. So getting started on the my first slide, credit ratings and the role of pensions. Essentially what we do is we assess the ability of governments, state and local governments, to meet their financial commitments. And so that essentially takes an assessment of what the financial challenges are that a government is likely to encounter going forward, and then the tools that they have to deal with those challenges. The scale that we rate on is very well known, I think. It's something that people encounter in the news, the AAA to D scale. But it's important to remember that we rate on a global basis on that same scale. So when you take state and local governments, even some of the places that are often considered less well run than others, let's say, they often look pretty good on a global basis, and so sometimes it may seem that a rating is high, but it's important to remember that it's really expressed for state and local governments at one end of a broad scale. So going to the next slide, what we really focus on for every rating is what is the economic framework of a particular entity, of a state, a county, a school district, a city, and what are the key rating factors that arise out of that economic framework. The long-term liability burden, so typically that's bonded debt in the financial markets. It may also be contingent obligations, and it also includes retirement obligations, both for pensions and OPEB. We also look at the revenue and expenditure frameworks, essentially focusing on the affordability of the spending commitments that a government has made relative to the resources that it's able to extract out of that economy, generally through taxes, but also through fees. And finally, operating performance. And part of that is assessing the institutional framework of a given entity. As you're all well aware of, states in general have very strong legal and institutional frameworks, and thus we view them as being very strong on the credit rating scale. But essentially what we're aiming for is a better understanding of the ability and the willingness of a state to actively manage their liabilities. So specifically for pensions, we really think of pensions as being very similar to bonded debt. They're both long-term obligations that will require a cash claim from the government for many years. Debt for roads, bridges, and schools, typically GO bonds, but also revenue bonds or lease obligations. Those are, pretty straightforward. There is a date certain on which a state is obligated to make a payment. Things get a little bit less fixed when it comes to talking about pensions. Every year, employees accrue more benefits. Retirees, or some make decisions to retire, and then of course retiree lifespans change. But there's also factors related to the volatility of investments in the pension portfolio, whether the actuary has fully taken into account other actuarial changes, different assumptions. In other words, while we view it as being a long-term debt-like obligation, we recognize that it's a number that is going to change over time. So part of what we seek to do is to understand the fiscal impact of it. We calculate metrics both on the balance sheet side and the income statement side. For balance sheet, we're really looking at the number, the tax-supported debt number plus the unfunded liability number. And on that unfunded liability, we make a couple of adjustments on our own to put it slightly more on an apples-to-apples basis. On the income statement side, we look at the carrying cost of liabilities, so debt service, principal and interest on bonds, plus the required contribution, or as it's now called, the actuarially determined contribution. We also focus on the role of management, and this is one that's really purely qualitative, but it's the willingness and ability of decision makers to really focus on problem solving. So a legislature, a city council, a county executive, to the extent that they are recognizing challenges on pensions in particular, and taking advantage of opportunities to make changes, that is something that we consider very strongly when we're assessing the credit quality of a government. Something that we need to underscore on my last bullet there, given the sheer volume of bad headlines on pensions and many of the reasonable concerns about pension sustainability, we believe that most governments are in a position to solve their pension challenges. It's rare for a pension challenge to be solved overnight. That's not the way it works, given that benefits are protected and states have made multi-decade commitments to retirees. But states have extraordinary powers over revenues and spending, and typically have the flexibility to make changes to pensions that over time will help them to, overcome questions of sustainability. However, there are a couple of cases, and I think you've probably become familiar with many of them, where pensions have been a significant burden that have changed our point of view on credit quality. Places like Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, different stories in every environment, but ones where pensions have played a role in past downgrade. So going to the kind of core of my remarks here, we publish an update every year on major pension trends for states. It has two focuses. The first focus is to calculate the burden for each state of debt and pensions as a percentage of personal income, and that's an economic figure from the federal government, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. But it essentially represents the wealth base from which taxes are drawn. State CAFRs, if you take them all and review the pension information disclosed in them, contain about 225 pension systems. Many are small, but about 100 are pretty significant. And so that report also focuses on those 100 what we call material plans and provides some trend analysis. So I'm now on slide 6, major pension trends. As of 2014, so our 2015 report focused on 2014 disclosure. Anything that was available up until about the beginning of October of 2015 is reflected in that report. But as of 2014, reported funded ratios for state pensions are generally stabilizing, but there's really no recovery in sight. In other words, their funded ratios are not back at the levels they were that they were at when the downturn began back in the latter part of 2007. On a funded basis, so on a basis considered by actuaries, plans funded ratios hit their trough in 2012. That's largely because of smoothing practices with assets, but is affected by numerous other things. On a market basis, it happened much faster, and recovery has been stronger. But it's important to note that plans have not returned to where they were. So moving on to slide 7, why hasn't there been more improvement? Part of it is the sheer magnitude of recessionary losses. The 2008-2009 recession was much deeper than most post-war recessions. It affected financial markets in particular, and pension funds as a result saw significant declines in their asset values, in some cases approaching the high 20%. There's been mixed market performance since then. Although we see asset values have gone up a lot, there have been several years where they have underperformed. And it's important to remember that pension plans assume a return typically between 7 and 8%. So if the financial markets have a return that's less than that level, theoretically that pension has had a bad year. So it's a slightly different yardstick than I think we're used to thinking of. Investment returns have also been lowered by many plans. This automatically causes actuarial liabilities to rise. Another factor is that benefit reforms are typically only affecting new workers. I think I mentioned earlier, benefits are generally protected for existing employees and certainly for existing retirees. The story differs slightly from state to state. Finally, many states have a history of making inadequate contributions to pensions. The yardstick here being the actuarially required contribution, or the annual required contribution, or the actuarially determined contribution. States often pay less than that for varying reasons, and I'll touch base on that more later. Finally, actuarial experience. Most pension plans go back and review their experience every couple of years. In other words, they take a look at what's actually happening with retirees and when employees are making retirement decisions. In general, retirements are getting longer, and so people are living longer. Those assumptions have to be incorporated by actuaries when calculating liabilities. So moving on to slide 8, another big trend happening right now is that we're transitioning to new GASB standards. This affects the reporting of pensions for accounting purposes. Pension systems were required to shift to GASB 67 for their 2014 reports. And for about 90% of the big 100 plans that I mentioned earlier, we have at least an actuarial valuation, if not a CAFR, under the new standards. And governments are making the change this year in their own CAFRs. So over the coming weeks and months, we're expecting to see a lot of state CAFRs with the new GASB 68 information. Lots of ink has been spilled on GASB's pension changes. We have our own points of view on the positives and negatives. On page 9, some of the positive impacts that we're seeing is it's improving the comparability in most cases, because liabilities are calculated using the same cost method, assets are on a market value basis, and then something that is particularly helpful is that the information is being stated at the same date as the financial report, which if anybody is familiar with multiple states' pensions, the timing of the information is generally all over the map. It can be 2 years earlier than the CAFR date. It can be the same as the CAFR date. It's challenging to compare systems when these timing factors affect the numbers. The new GASB accounting is giving us some new tools to understand liabilities and risks. Chief among these, I would argue, is the requirement that all cost-sharing employers, so these big multi-employer systems that many states manage for instance, schools and local governments, those local governments will now incorporate information on their share of the obligation for the plan. And so that provides a lot more clarity on where the responsibility rests for paying off the liability. And then the sensitivity analysis is a simple set of figures that GASB requires that will give us a window onto the relative risks to the plan. And that's going to be something that we spend a lot more focus on in the future. Finally, we now have, courtesy of the new requirements, a clearer figure for what the normal what's called the normal cost, or used to be called the normal cost. Now it's called the service cost of each individual pension plan. Now that essentially represents the cost of the benefits this year, and that used to primarily be expressed in a percentage of payroll, which wasn't always a super clear way of understanding it. Moving to page 10, the GASB changes also have a few negative effects. The ARC is a figure that, while not a perfect figure, is one that has become the de facto yardstick for measuring whether a government is making progress on paying off its liability. And so losing the ARC as a required disclosure in some cases is giving us, we feel, a little less clarity. The depletion date is another new feature of GASB. It's not something that we think adds a lot of value. And then the funding and accounting perspective, this is something that's been discussed significantly. It creates, it can create some confusion, particularly for financial statement users. And then finally, something that we will see in 2015, the new GASB figures are going to be creating a lot more volatility in how pensions look. When you look at their ratios of assets to liabilities, the fact that assets are now going to be on a market value basis means that you'll see that ratio rising and falling in bigger jumps than you're used to under the old funding assumptions. So continuing on the major pension trends, one of the things we saw in 2014 was that states and governments are making bigger contributions to their plans, and they're making more of the actuarially required contribution, more than they have since hitting their low point in 2011. This is a positive because it means that governments are taking more seriously the challenge of putting the unfunded liability behind them. Moving on to slide 12, contribution trends are still, despite the improvement, they're still below where actuaries have calculated they should be. There are really two categories of inadequate contributions. One is where there's just consistent underpayment. Sometimes states or local governments set a statutory level, but then don't go back and reset that statutory level to match what's actually happening in the plan. And another category of problematic practice stems from the widespread thinking that cutting the ARC was a way to resolve a budget problem. If you make a cut to your contribution, you save money in 1 year, but in effect, you're borrowing from the future because you're starving the plan of assets that would grow over time. Fitch views all of those practices essentially as deficit financing. Moving on to slide 13, and a really important caveat in this conversation about the ARC is it's never been a great indicator. It really reflects some competing goals for pension plans, whether to focus on amortization or whether to focus on smoothing contributions. And most governments, rightly perhaps, think that smoother contributions is something that is desirable. relative to making progress on amortization. But under existing actuarial practice, there have been problematic assumptions, that a certain combination of assumptions that result in what's called negative amortization. So despite making a full ARC payment, you can actually continue to see the UAAL grow from year to year. And that's a problem that we've begun to flag in pension systems, and something that we're focusing on increasingly. On slide 14, another problem for pensions, a growing challenge for pensions, I should say, is demographic erosion. The ratio of actives to retirees for many plans is falling toward 1. In other words, that there's 1 retiree for every active employee. The ratio of actives to retirees used to be much higher. Moving on to page 15, it reflects a lot of factors. Public employment is flat. Governments have been reluctant to expand services in recent years. Technology certainly has an impact, but in general, as public employment has flattened, retiree numbers have gone up. These are the retirees who started working for government often decades ago, when population growth was such that services needed to expand. What that means is that the plans are falling under more stress as a result. They receive less in contributions from active employees, and they pay out more in benefits to this larger pool of retirees. It's harder in this environment to recover from market shocks. The pension has to be geared more toward its investment portfolio, has to have more cash on hand to pay out benefits. And that's often in direct contrast to the desire to try to ensure that investment returns remain high, which means that pensions are striving for longer dated or riskier asset allocations. So moving on to page 16, the other part of our annual pension report focuses on the burden that states carry from debt and pensions. And we measure this burden against states' personal income. This chart on page 16 is what we describe as the ski slope. And it doesn't change significantly from year to year. But on the left-hand side, there are states where pensions and debt together represent a higher percentage of personal income. In other words, the liabilities are relatively high. And going to the right, the states have lower burden of pension and debt to personal income. Moving on to page 17, Fitch measures those liabilities against the personal income base, because that's, again, it's a measure of the economic activity that is taxed by governments in order to cover service commitments. The debt component is generally lower, and that reflects what are long-standing state practices going back decades to control debt, keep it as a relatively narrow practice used primarily for capital among U.S. states. Debt burdens as a result of that are spread across a relatively narrow range. Some states have very little debt or no debt at all, such as Nebraska. A few have higher debt, and that often has to do with their commitment to funding school capital at the local level. That's certainly the case with Hawaii at 10.2%, the high. The range of burdens for pensions is far higher. It goes from 0.2% to a high of 19.4%. Wisconsin is uniquely low for its pension burden. partly because of the way it shares risk with retirees in terms of its ability to actually lower benefit payments when the plan is doing poorly. So it's hard to imagine an environment where Wisconsin is going to have a significantly higher burden. Illinois, I think folks are familiar with the challenges they've had with pensions, and the longer those challenges have gone unresolved, the higher that burden has become. But other disparate factors affect the burden of pensions. It's often around whether a state is committed to funding the teacher pensions in a given state. Moving on to slide 18, the range of state debt and pension burdens also reflects a couple of other things. If there are pension obligation bonds outstanding, we include that as debt. When a state or a government issues POBs, it essentially takes some pension liability and turns it into a debt liability, so it doesn't change the overall figure. That pension figure does not include all pensions in a state. If it's a cost-sharing plan, we take that into account. We make an allocation to the state just for the portion of the pension obligation that the state is responsible for. And again, typically that is a question for cost-sharing plans, and often states pick up the cost of teacher pensions. So just to conclude here, the takeaways on page 19, we're at an interesting point for pensions. The recovery now is about 6 years old. Many of the trends have been in place since the downturn ended, continue to be in place. Funded ratios are improving very slowly, but funded ratio improvement is not guaranteed, and in many places, recovery from the recession remains a long way off. As a result, contributions to pensions are likely to remain elevated. They are not the largest expenditure of state governments, not by a long shot, but they are rising, and they're likely to remain high while plans continue to try to recoup the losses from the last downturn and to address unfunded liabilities. Governments are also responding by making reforms to pensions, and this is something that we love to see. This includes clarifying how far they can go legally to change benefits. Questions are often around the margins of this, such as whether COLAs can be lowered, and those end up resulting in litigation, but we expect this trend to continue. At this moment, we also see some new factors coming into play. The Actuarial Standards Board is thinking about changing the way they essentially review and calculate and disclose pension risk, and that's something that bears watching. It's not going to change accounting for pensions, but it may change the actuarial valuation and the way the actuary himself or herself describes the risks that governments face. And so we're watching that intently. Systems in general are focusing on risk identification and mitigation, and in some cases on risk sharing. So California, in CalPERS and CalSTRS, just in the last few weeks, for instance, have announced changes to their investment portfolios to lower risk. That's only one method of addressing risk. Another method is to shift portions of risk onto employees. Other methods include lowering discount rates. There are numerous ways of doing it. It's a trend that we see picking up steam. And finally, another new factor that may come into play is the eventual recession, whatever the next one is, whenever it hits. The impact on pensions is to be determined, but it's one that we're eager to understand as we see the changes that have been made in pensions over the last decade. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sujit, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Doug, for those insightful remarks. Representative Ivey, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. First, I would like to clarify that I am by no means an expert, but just a humble public servant. And the reality is, when dealing with pension reform in really any state, but especially Louisiana, is that it really has a real steep learning curve, and it's hard to create amount of understanding with all the legislators serving on a bunch of different committees and really having different areas of expertise and having a competent conversation on what the problem really is. And this obviously becomes a problem whenever legislation is created for reform, and more often than not, it becomes more of a political argument than a policy-driven argument. So on the first slide, we have, in Louisiana, we have 4 state systems, retirement systems, teachers, ELSers for the school employees that are not teachers, and we have the state police retirement system. It's only for our troopers, and we also have lasers, which is really the system for any other state employee. Now, by far, our 2 biggest systems are TRSL and lasers. They're probably 80–90% of all the current assets and liabilities as well. Next page. In Louisiana, we've made some progress. We've made some very smart decisions, I believe, in the past. I've only served for 3 years now, going on my 4th. And we've done some things in the past to really stop the systemic growth of UAL. And the reasons that we've had them pre-1988, we were in a situation where the state just decided not to pay its obligations at times. You know, when they didn't have the money, we'll just defer it. The payment, and that created a liability of about $5 billion because of that decision right there over the years. And so in 1987, we had a constitutional amendment that was enacted that actually required an actuarial soundness of our retirement systems. We actually were forcing ourselves to pay the bills. And also we basically financed that $5 billion that we originally had, and in my opinion, is one of the worst decisions. The way we did it, we financed it for 40 years, and we back-ended the payments. So we really underpaid in the very beginning, and starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and those payments have ballooned, and we're actually just now getting into the principal portion of those payments. And so that decision has cost us a fortune to structure the payment of that particular pension liability back then. Some other reforms that we've done, we've increased the contribution rate. We've done this several times. I won't discuss all of them individually, but in 1988 we increased it to 0.5%, and then also right now it's actually 8%. So we've had another increase. A lot of little things all add up. Limited sick leave and annual leave that can convert to the service credit for teachers retirement system. Next. We also did several times on the different systems. We've reduced salary spiking. That's helped a little bit. It's not a major savings, but it was a modest reform. We also have changed the required actuarial reduction for benefits for 20 years. Again, it shows there about $15.6 million in savings. These things were all done, obviously, long before I was a legislator and really involved in the process. In 2005, again, we increased the contribution rate for lasers, which, again, is one of our 2 main systems. We also limited the eligibility on retirement to 10 years of service at age 60. We increased the final average compensation from 3 to 5 years, which was a fairly significant savings there, and helped limit help prevent spiking. We also again changed the spiking cap from 25 to 15%. Next. And again, in 2006, we changed the final average compensation for ELSers, which is one of our smaller systems. And in 2007, we had a constitutional amendment that requires the actuarial cost of benefit increases at the state retirement system to be paid within 10 years. This was a major reform, in my opinion, because what has happened in the past is every time there was an expansion of a benefit, we wouldn't have to pay for it today. We just basically roll it up in the unfunded liability. And, you know, when you're talking about a bunch of politicians making political decisions, whether it be a benefit for teachers or whomever, it's easier to just consider what the political gains may be today and not worry about the cost that's going to have down the road. And so by doing that, you know, we can actually have an actual cost of what it's going to be, you know, to pay it down, to pay for that benefit in a 10-year period. In 2009, we did restructure the UAL a little bit. We reduced payments in the future years. We did prioritize excess investment earnings. Louisiana has what we call it experience account, and it's a way that we fund COLAs. It's changed over the last few years, but it's one of the few mechanisms that we have built in to, you know, fund a COLA outside of general fund, state general fund monies. And we use legislation to appropriate and fund from accounts to reduce the UAL. These were, again, every little bit helps, but none of this amounts to a significant amount of money to actually get out of debt much quicker. Again, it all helps, but these are, you know, in some cases, we set triggers in place where if revenues exceeded X amount of dollars, then, you know, some of those monies would kick in. And in some situations, you know, some of those triggers haven't even been met with the way the market's been lately and those revenue sources themselves. Next. All right, we did create a new tier in 2010 for new members of the retirement systems hired after January 2011. We created a 5-year vesting period. We changed retirement age at 60 or with 20 years of service, actuarially reduced, and also just made it to where it was a 5-year final average compensation for all other systems who weren't on that. We created a uniform provisions for our hazardous duty service plans in the state trooper within the state troopers or state police retirement system and the lasers plan that had a hazardous duty component as well. We did place limits on the teachers' return to work because some teachers would retire and then immediately go back to work. So in order to, you know, to kind of prevent some of that, we created some time limits that they'd have to wait before they could return to work. And a major reform that we did was in 2010 was a constitutional amendment that required 2/3 legislative approval on any new retirement provision that had an actuarial cost. Now, this greatly limits expansion of benefits. When you have to get a 2/3 vote requirement, it takes a lot of the politics out on that side. It also becomes a challenge, though, on some of our reforms that where there may be an actuarial cost. It doesn't matter if it's $1. If there's any actuarial cost, it's going to require a 2/3 vote. In 2012, I believe, right the year before I came to the legislature, the governor was able to pass a cash balance plan as a method of pension reform. Unfortunately, and personally, I didn't agree with everything in that plan. I wasn't here to vote for it. But nonetheless, because of the 2/3 provision, it actually got appealed. It went to court, and it got thrown out because we only had a simple majority vote on that, and the courts deemed that there was an actuarial cost and basically ended up throwing it out, besides some of the other problems that it had with it. All right, next. All right. In 2011, we had a constitutional amendment to provide for a minimum of non-recurring revenue to be applied toward reducing the old UAL. I told you about the $5 billion that we initially had in going back for decades, and we rolled that up into one lump sum, and so we did divert some of those monies to try to accelerate that being paid down. And in 2012, in Louisiana, unfortunately, we're famous in past years for politicians going to prison for a host of reasons. And one of the things that they did was to basically, anybody who was convicted of a felony act would have to forfeit their pension. 2014, this is when since I've been here, we've tried in different ways to increase how much money either stays in the current plan, particularly when we're dealing with COLAs. In our experience account, the COLA was receiving, we would fund the experience account with excess gains, but they would get most of the excess gains, and depending on what the returns were that year. And then the next year, if there was a loss the following year, we wouldn't take any of those monies out of the experience account that was going to be used to fund a COLA. And so it really diverted more monies to COLA benefits than we should, and considering we were at a funding level of around 60% or less at the time. And we also swept excess ELSER's COLA accounts, and there was a few other things that we did to help just pay down some of the debt. So this is the past, some of the things we've done. I've spoken with people who've been around the pension process for a while, some of them working for the systems, the pension systems themselves, and they all look at these things and they say, well, we've done lots of pension reform, and I'm trying to have pension reform, but comprehensive pension reform. And so they equate some of these things that we've done in the past, and we've done a lot of little things. And there's a few major things that we've done, particularly the constitutional amendments are very key. But in my opinion, none of them have curtailed the creation of UAL in the system. And so I am having a conversation with my colleagues right now on on comprehensive pension reform. Next slide, please. Now, I don't have a lot of slides on this, and I'll be speaking more than I have on the slide. This is my only slide right here to discuss future improvements. Now, politics changed significantly since I began my work on pension reform. If anybody followed the governor's race in Louisiana, we actually we're a very red state, but we actually elected a Democrat for governor. He's actually a colleague in the House, so I know him fairly well. And that somewhat changed what I thought I was going to be running pension reform more on a downhill slope, and now it may be on more of an uphill slope, just with the election and all. So to get to the slide here, right now we require, well, actually what I'd like to do is require state systems to pre-fund administrative costs through explicit inclusion in the contribution rate calculation. Basically what's happened is within our systems about little over 20 years ago, because of a law, they started financing the administrative costs to the systems. Well, right now what's happened after 20 or so years, the total cost, and it was a 30-year amortization they put these administrative costs on. So the annual costs when they started this were approximately a couple $1 million a year. Now the annual administrative costs for a couple of these plans are $18 to $20 million a year. And so the current payment for when you add up every year was amortized over 30 years. When you add up all of those payments, now the payment is as much as what what it's actually costing us if we would just go ahead and pay the annual cost. So I am working on legislation to fix that problem. I'm going to go ahead and do it. That's something that we need to do on the current system. Also, on the current system, we need to establish a side account for excess contributions so we can actually help stabilize the employer contribution rates. As our liabilities go down, when they recalculate the employer cost, or what will happen is instead of making less and less payments, if we levelize those payments, we'll actually be able to get out of debt much sooner. So that's something that we can do with the current system to help get out of debt. Now, for going forward, I'd like to see a DC-DB hybrid for our new hires. I'm going to go into some details on what that entails, and then also a key goal for me is to split more evenly the cost between the employee and the taxpayer. Right now in Louisiana, the taxpayer is on the hook for 100% of any unfunded liability. And when the taxpayer is on the hook for it, sometimes the decisions that are made within the systems don't reflect the risk that the taxpayer has to bear. And so if they're not going to have to, if it's not going to cost them, then maybe they might be a little more aggressive on certain investments to increase monies to the experience account to help fund COLAs. All right. First, I started with the concept of trying to create a retirement system that was fair for the employee and the taxpayer. And one key thing I did was I didn't start with any particular limit on the price tag. In times past, what we've tried to do is start with the price, try to save money from there, and create a system that reflects a cost. And that's very difficult, and often it creates problems on what, in my opinion, is fair for retirement benefit for a new employee. And part of the problem that we have when discussing pension reform, I've already mentioned, is the very large hurdle for understanding the problem and the complexities that exist within our retirement systems. There's also a gross misunderstanding, in my opinion, from a fiscal perspective regarding what the actual costs of our current pension systems are. Normal cost is what many legislators focus on, and that's roughly 12% depending on which system we're talking about. Now, the actual cost, which is the unfunded liability cost that we have to pay annually, plus the normal cost, is between 25 to 30%. And that is with our unfunded liability calculated on a 30-year amortization. Now, in 1989, we did these major reforms, and we decided to finance that $5 billion. Well, we still have that liability on the books, but since then, we've created $15 billion in new UL since approximately 1990. Now, since then, the state has met all of its obligations on an annual basis. We haven't decided to not pay, even during some of the lean times. So we've always paid on time. And even still, we have a $15 billion unfunded liability across our systems right now. Now, we also have one of the other problems that exists when talking about pension reform is sometimes in Louisiana we have a legislative auditor and we have our own actuaries, in-house actuaries within that department, and there are sometimes discrepancies between what our staff actuaries deem reasonable and within a range versus what the systems actuaries believe. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there sometimes, and when discussing the discount rate and many other actuarial assumptions, little small changes, whether it be 0.25% or more, have major impact to the current unfunded liability and the creation of more unfunded liability down the road if those assumptions aren't met. Like I said, currently the entire burden of responsibility for UAL and new UAL is borne on the taxpayer, and I believe it should be a shared responsibility between the taxpayer and the employee. Now, timing, I believe, is very interesting for Louisiana, and it's a key point that I'm trying to make to my colleagues because right now in Louisiana, we've been dealing with systemic budget shortfalls year after year after year. And part of the reason is because, and we have cut and cut and cut for years, and what we really have is a structural deficit that has to be addressed through a change in tax policy. Now, being that in Louisiana everyone is keenly aware that we're going to have a tax reform special session and really start to address some of these problems, I believe that it is absolute perfect timing to discuss pension reform at the same time. By doing it in the here's an example. How can we discuss tax reform without discussing the paying down the unfunded liability in a more expeditious manner? Paying the debt off in 30 years, in my opinion, costs us tens of billions of dollars. But if we can pay that off much sooner, then those savings will be realized in a much shorter period of time, and we'll be able to pay for all the things that we're complaining about not having funding for, mainly infrastructure and improvements in education. It's like trying to create a household budget without having any real plan to pay off your mortgage. And the reality is, we don't have a plan, and we don't have any specific resources dedicated to accelerating the payment of the unfunded liability. It's just kind of putting on that 30-year credit card, and eventually it may get paid off. But between now and 30 years from now, I can assure you that we'll have new liabilities created. Now, my goals for reform are a win-win-win scenario. It's got to be a win for new employees. I want them to receive as good a benefit or better as what is currently being offered. I also want to accelerate the unfunded liability payments for that way current employees in the current systems will actually have the monies available for them when they retire. And also, portability with the hybrid plan becomes an option. Right now, portability is not available with the current systems. Portability is good because quite often people may only want to work 5 to 10 years in the state government and decide to go do something else. Also, particularly with higher ed, it becomes a very attractive option when, under the current pension restrictions that we have right now, what we found is many of our higher ed, many of our colleges aren't able to attract the talent that they would like because of the limitations that are on our current pension system. Also, it needs to be a win-win for the taxpayer. What we need to do is greatly limit the responsibility of future UAL with the new retirement vehicle. We need to share that. We also, the risk in the new plan will need to be shared between the taxpayer and the employee. We need to have and also here's a key factor as well, having representation of taxpayers on the retirement systems boards. That is right now that it doesn't exist. The only people on the boards, the people who really control the investment decisions, the people who control much of the some of the policies that aren't set in legislation, are active members and retirees. And so I believe that the taxpayer is not represented adequately on these boards. And also, current employees and retirees, again, we need to accelerate the payoff of the UAL so we can honor the promises that we've made to them. And also, another thing that we can do with this is once we start paying down a liability and money's become available, we can actually structure a COLA benefit to our current employee, our current retirees that isn't there. They sporadically get COLAs when the money's in the experience account or the legislature appropriates it, which is fairly rare in our state. So this is it in a nutshell. I'd be happy to answer any questions on any of the specifics, but this is my overall goal for pension reform in Louisiana.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Representative Ivey. Representative Ross, you have the floor.
Okay, I think I'm on now. I'm going to start first with just a little bit of a snapshot of the North Carolina pension system, and that would be the first slide. The North Carolina pension system is valued at approximately $90 billion. It's consistently ranked in the top 5 states for pension funding. And there are 1 out of 10 states right now that have a AAA bond rating from all 3 rating agencies, and North Carolina is one of those. The North Carolina pension system itself is the 12th largest pension fund in the U.S., and it's the 26th largest in the world. It supports more than 900,000 current and former public employees in North Carolina. It's a large plan. It's funded by employer contributions, employee contributions, and earnings from investments. That's kind of a snapshot of where we are. And the next slide, we'll take a look at some of the funding situation for North Carolina. It's currently 96% funded. This is as of the end of 2014. And I think some of the reasons for the funding rate that we have is that number one, our contributions are funded as recommended by our actuaries, and that's been the case for 73 out of 74 years. Roughly half of the average contribution comes from employees, and we have conservative assumptions with greater than a 50% chance of gains over much of the history. We really spread it out over time. We use a 12-year amortization on unfunded liability, and any benefit increases that we have in North Carolina are immediately matched by a contribution rate increase. So basically what you have here is a story of long-term discipline and some hard choices that we've had to make. We've increased our contributions in North Carolina by $248 million in 2011, and did that in a very tight budget year when the General Assembly was making a lot of other cuts. There's not really any quick fix to any of this. You just have to kind of build a culture of long-term thinking, and that's what we're trying to do here in the General Assembly. On the next slide, it will show some of the actions that we've taken since 2008. And this is an ongoing process. This by no means is everything that's going on now, because there are a lot of efforts being done through some studies and some work currently that will bring on some additional reforms. But what we've done so far is we have increased employer contributions. We've gone from 3.36% of pay to 9.15% of pay. That's roughly $600 million more every year, which is about 3% of our state's general fund. And again, this has all been done in the midst of very tight budgets. We've had separate reform efforts that had not been required due to our long-standing funding policies. We've actually had minimal benefit changes. Now back in, I think it was 2010, they increased the vesting from 5 to 10 years, and then we just reversed that back to 5 years. Now we did that more for human resource competitive reasons in order to try to bring the pension plan back more competitive with some of the surrounding states. We also implemented in the last session anti-spiking provisions, and we've actually had minimal COLAs. We've had a 2% total increase in benefits since 2008. And this is really kind of from sort of a nature that we've had with COLAs. We do not require, or we do not have a separate statute in order to change COLAs. In other words, there's no automatic COLA in the North Carolina plan. We're able to make adjustments when we feel that the revenue and the opportunity is there to do it, and it has helped us to stay out of the situation of having to reduce benefits. Now, on the next slide, we're looking at some of the challenges that we face today, actuarial assumptions, investment returns. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. Our current assumption here in North Carolina is 7.25%. That's a little lower than a lot of states. We have had a good chance of achieving that over 30 years. I think most people in the investment world know that longer-term investments have a better chance of achieving success the longer they're held. So when we look at this on a 30-year basis, we tend to outperform the 7.25. But it is actually getting much harder to meet that than it has been in the years past. We've had quite a rally in markets since 2008. I think everybody is pretty much aware that a lot of that has slowed. And we're starting to see some of that in some of the numbers that are coming in on our investment returns now. In fact, our third quarter numbers, I think, were in the negative. So it's going to get a little harder as we go forward, and that's something that we're keenly aware of and looking at where we can make adjustments to make that work. Each reduction of 1% raises our contribution by 9, and that's about 4.5% of our total budget. So any change that we do has to be gradual. And mortality, this is really the tough one because it's a moving target. It changes. There are new tables that have been developed by the Society of Actuaries, and the combined effect of the new tables and other assumptions is 1.32% of our employer contributions. And I think one of the major issues that has probably affected pretty much most all of our pension plans, especially the defined benefit plans, is the fact that when these plans were designed, life expectancy was much shorter than it is now. And with new developments in science and medicine, that number continues to get longer and wider, and adds, just by the nature of the way it works, adds a huge amount of liability to the plans, and a very, very tough challenge to try to calculate exactly what that's going to be. On the next slide, we mentioned some of those challenges. Our contribution rate is calculated in valuation, projected to peak and then decline. And some of the responses that we're looking at there are to either let the rate decline and spend the funds elsewhere to cut taxes, or improve benefits to the plan, or to keep the contribution rate roughly constant and improve the funding situation for the plan. And the third is probably more in line with the direction that we seem to be going. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about our benefit design. Our benefit generosity is roughly at a median now in its relation to the other states. We've avoided significant benefit improvements that took place back in the late 90s. And those that were around back in the late 90s will remember there were a number of benefit improvements that were cooked into pension plans in the late 90s. And as a result, many of the plans are paying the price now. We were able to avoid that. And we haven't made any significant changes in recent years. Other states have gone into have been a little more generous, and they've had to reverse their course and in some cases cut back. We've avoided that cycle, but we're looking at really as we speak ways to consider benefit changes, maybe for other reasons, and some examples of that would be for competitiveness and human resource incentives. Now, we've worked over the past few years in a special committee here in the General Assembly that is trying to really get a grip on where we are, because we recognize that long-term the unfunded liability situation with defined benefit plans is going to get worse before it ever gets better. And as a result, we have been doing excuse me, we've been doing some things, and I mentioned a moment ago, in our first session, our first year, we pretty much took care of what we call low-hanging fruit. We we modified and eliminated the problem that we had with pension spiking. That's a small issue, but it did add up into a sizable amount of money. Another thing that we did was we recognized that we did not have the personnel needed on a pension plan this size. This plan also manages money for our local government system in North Carolina and other government agencies. And we didn't have the administrative personnel necessary to really effectively keep up with things like contributions coming into the plan and even retirement payments going out of the plan. So we hired additional administrative personnel to specifically work in an area, in those two areas, and as a result, I think we spent somewhere just under $1 million in personnel cost. And in the first year that we implemented this, we found $20 million in, or roughly $20 million in funding that was just slipping out, that we either we weren't collecting or we were paying out in overpayments. Other things that we're doing now, the committee is meeting. This is a joint committee between the House and the Senate, and we're looking at other opportunities to improve our plan, because we know that pension planning is changing, and what employees expect is actually beginning to change. And we're looking at a number of different plans. We're looking at what some of the other states are doing. You've heard mentioned the defined benefit, defined contribution hybrid. That's something that we'll look at. That's something that's done by our 3 neighboring states. And we're also looking at what employees, the whole nature of how a person works today is different than it was years ago. Younger people coming into employment now many times don't work as many years as their forefathers. They may work just a few years and move on to another job. They want portability, so we're looking at more ways to be able to provide that, and that's obviously something that you can do better in some sort of a hybrid or defined contribution plan. And we're looking for more flexibility in our administration of the plan, in the investment administration of the plan. We had legislation that I proposed in the last session to grant a little more flexibility to our administrator, which is our state treasurer, in the investment choices that they make in order to take advantage of different markets and to give greater diversification to the plan. The thing that I realized as I was pushing that piece of legislation through the General Assembly was that there were very, very few members of either the House or the Senate that really understood the nature of, or the complexity of investments and how they work in a pension plan, or any other plan for that matter. And it made it very difficult to try to get that piece of legislation passed. We ultimately did get it done. But those are the challenges that you run into in trying to modify something as complex and complicated as a pension plan. And that's why to me, it's a slow process, because not only are you trying to make improvements to the plan, but you're also at the same time having to educate a lot of people on exactly what each piece of it means and how it works. And then the other part of it is trying to get other members to understand some of the long-term consequences of, if you do this, this is what happens 30 years down the road, or if you don't do this, this is what can take place 30 years down the road. In North Carolina, and I'm sure it's this way in a lot of states, everything seems to get done on what I call a short-term basis, which is 2 years. And pension planning and the solutions that that it's going to take to really balance pension plans and get them where they need to be is a longer-term process. It's not a 2-year one session, in and out type of deal. You can't flip a switch and fix it. And that's the dilemma. That's where we are now. We're really trying to take a little bit longer term approach in finding the right solutions, looking at what works and what doesn't work. We don't want to make mistakes because we are talking about a lot of money, and we're talking about retirees' futures and a lot of liability that can be created by making a mistake. So, you know, these are the issues that we deal with. And as time goes on, I'm hopeful that the committee that I'm working with will be able to come up with good solutions for North Carolina and continue to keep us moving in the right direction and keep us in one of the better sound positions that our plan is in the nation. And so that's where we are, and you know, we can go from here and maybe answer any questions that anybody has.
Great. Thank you very much, Representative Ross, for that very astute presentation. We are running out of time. We've gone a little over, so we have to wrap up this webinar, but I just wanted to say that I've been tracking and researching on this topic for about 15 years now for the SLC, and what we heard today, I believe, are some of the three finest presentations on this topic. It really captures the essence of the kind of challenges that states are going through and really presents some of the solutions that are concrete and practical. So I want to thank all three of our presenters for this very, very useful information that they conveyed to us. In terms of questions, I know there was a question about the average annual rate of return, but I believe Representative Ross did an excellent job addressing that, and I hope that information would be useful to the questioner. But in the meantime, if you have any additional questions, please forward them to me, and I will work on getting a response to you from the different presenters. Thank you also to my CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for all her help, and for all of y'all for spending this afternoon, this 1 hour or so of your afternoon with us, and I hope you found this webinar as useful as I found the information. If there's anything more that CSG or SLC can do for you, please don't hesitate to contact us. Have a great afternoon.